The same structures seem to be taking shape in China and in Southeast Asia. In countries run in this way, no matter how benevolently, public opinion exerts little influence on government decisions. So the result of the replacement of democratic institutions with power structures such as these would be something like a return to feudalism. Elections might still be held, but they would be as meaningless as was the recent election to the Russian Duma. Careers would be less open to talents and more dependent on connections with powerful persons. Since the courts and the police review boards would have become powerless, it might become necessary for shopkeepers to pay protection money to the police or to criminals tolerated by the police in order to stay in business. It would be dangerous for citizens to complain about corruption or about abuse of power by public officials. High culture would be pruned back to areas that are without political relevance, as in Russia under Stalin and his successors and in today's China. No more uncensored media, no more student demonstrations, not much in the way of civil society. In short, a return to something like the Ancien Regime, with the national security establishment of each country playing the role played in pre-revolutionary France by the court at Versailles. Life for much of the world would not be greatly changed if the dismal scenario I have just outlined were to play out in the West. For in the poor countries, most of society has always been, and still is, organized along feudal lines. In the slums of Bangkok and Lima, and in the villages of equatorial Africa and Central Asia, nobody would notice that the world had changed, that a light had gone out. But in the countries in which the greatest moral progress has been made, that progress would cease. After a few generations, utopian fantasies of an open society would be cherished only by a few readers of old books. Perhaps I and the many Americans who agree with me have been so frightened by Ashcroft that we are seeing monsters in every dark corner. I hope this is the case, but I can't help thinking that democratic institutions in my country have become fragile. I'm half persuaded by Chalmers Johnson's claim in his book, The Sorrows of Empire, that, quote, the United States is probably lost to militarism. Johnson produces a lot of evidence to show that the military has already acquired so much power that the best an American president can now do is to negotiate with the Pentagon rather than giving it orders. The ongoing transfer of foreign policy from the State Department to the Department of Defense is likely further to weaken the presidency. I suspect that the precedent set by my government's reactions to 9/11 will influence the reactions of the governments of the other democracies if similar events occur in Europe. It's certainly in the Pentagon's interest to see that they do. So if terrorism on the 9/11 scale does come to Europe, it seems likely that the Ashcroft scenario will be repeated. The security agencies and the military are not yet as powerful in the EU countries as they have become in the US, but they will suddenly see the chance and the need to seize powers that they had not previously claimed. And these efforts will be cheered on by the junta in Washington. If one finds the fears I've been voicing plausible, one will wonder whether there might be something the citizens of the Western democracies could do to make it less likely that their grandchildren will live under the sort of neo-feudalism that I've described. The only thing I can think of is they might begin to question the culture of governmental secrecy. The obvious places for demands for openness to start are in the areas of nuclear weaponry and of intelligence gathering, for that was where the post-World War II obsession with secrecy began. As a first step, the citizenry might insist on reopening the topic of nuclear disarmament. They could demand that their governments publish the facts about their stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. Then they might insist that those governments make public the details of two sets of plans. Plans for responding to the use of such weapons by other governments, and plans for their use by criminal gangs such as Al-Qaeda. They should also demand that their governments subject these plans to the requirements of an updated jus in bello and an updated International Code of Criminal Justice. Such updating, the need for which David Kretzmer and many other legal scholars have made clear, would provide a good occasion to draw up new international agreements and to think about how to restructure the United Nations. If Western governments were forced to disclose and discuss what they plan to do in various particular sorts of emergencies, It would be at least slightly harder for ruggedly individualistic authoritarians holding high governmental positions to make use of these emergencies for their own purposes. For emergencies are less likely to produce institutional change if they have been publicly discussed in detail ahead of time. Furthermore, if the governments of the European democracies were forced to publicize and discuss their plans, it would be more difficult for the EU governments to concede control of world affairs to the United States. It would be harder, for example, for the German and French governments to get away with the tacit assumption that, since Washington will eventually do something about Pakistan and North Korea, the EU need not worry its head about Asia. There's no good reason why the governments of France, Britain, the US, and Israel should not inform their citizens of how many nuclear devices of which sorts they presently have in stock, how much these cost, how many of what kinds they propose to build in the future, and under what circumstances it is imagined that these devices will be used. Nor is there any good reason not to disclose the full history of the development of chemical and biological weapons, to tell the American public, for example, why their tax money was used to develop something called weapons-grade anthrax. Nor is there any reason to keep secret either the intelligence budgets or the agreements that have made it possible to girdle the globe with US military bases. There was little enough reason for refusing to make this sort of information public even when the Cold War was at its height. It's hard to imagine what help it would give to the terrorists if it were now disclosed. The progress humanity made in the 19th and 20th centuries was largely due to the increased role of public opinion in determining governmental policies. But the lack of public concern about governmental secrecy has, in the last 60 years, created a new political culture in most of the democracies. In Europe and in North America, elites have come to believe that they cannot carry out their mission of providing national security if their deliberations are carried out in public, and 9/11 only strengthened this conviction. Further attacks are likely to persuade those elites that they must destroy democracy in order to save it. Historians may someday have to explain why the West's golden age lasted only 200 years. The saddest pages in their books will be those in which they describe how the citizens of the democracies, by their craven acquiescence in governmental secrecy, helped bring about the disaster.